Hello again, and welcome back to Dr. Vaughn's Philosophy 101 online mini-lectures. This is the historical context of the modern period, the Renaissance, and the rise of skepticism. The transcript for this series is available for download on the notes page of my website. This is Part 3, the Geographical Revolution. It's difficult, and indeed may be impossible, for us to fully grasp how a medieval person understood the world around them. But even if we might not be able to fully grasp how they saw things, it is important for us to try. It's only in imagining different points of view that we can step outside our own perspective and begin the process of transformation that Socrates called the examined life. But it's equally important to recognize that just because someone lived in a different time, that doesn't make them essentially different from ourselves. It isn't the case, as you might have heard, or perhaps even said yourself, that people were just different back then, as if that somehow explained things. From an objective point of view, humans, as humans, haven't really changed very much since we fully emerged some 200 or 300,000 years ago. What has changed about us are the beliefs that we hold as expressed in our cultures. These cognitions get expressed in lots of different ways, but among the most significant are the intellectual paradigms or worldviews that are expressions of the collective consciousness of people in different places and at different times. Medieval Western Europe was, of course, no exception. There was a commonly held worldview that helped medieval people get through their lives, and one aspect of that paradigm was the concept of sacred geography. In early human worldviews, physical geography was often considered sacred geography, where place is endowed with sacral meaning. A place was more or less important not because you did or didn't own it, or didn't live there, but because it was more or less important on the cosmic scale of meaning. Another way of thinking about this very different view of the world is to recognize that the question where was sometimes subordinate to the question why. Where a place existed in the world was determined by why it existed in the world. For example, this Babylonian map, preserved on a clay tablet, demonstrates both the ethnocentric element of early worldviews as well as the notion of sacred geography. The center of the world, Mesopotamia, is the place where Babylon was located. Other powerful people and city-states are depicted on the edge of the world, away from the people that the map represents. Babylon is the center of the world because it's what mattered most to those making the map. But this map also demonstrates the relationship between the physical and sacred world. Beyond the ocean are 7 islands, which represent the celestial realm, which, as in Aristotle's astronomy, is not just a different place, but is also a different kind of place. This conception of the ordinary and heavenly worlds connected through a great ocean that surrounds the land would come to influence ancient European paradigms of the world, and would continue to shape geographical paradigms right down to the Renaissance. Here we see the early Greek philosopher Anaximander's interpretation of the Mesopotamian paradigm of geographical representation, followed shortly by an even more accurate representation by another early Greek intellectual, Hecataeus. Notice how Greece is effectively the center of the world, which for a Greek living in the 6th century BCE would have made sense. This is geography from an ethnocentric point of view. These ethnocentric island Earth paradigms, passed down from the ancient to the medieval world, would become more abstract as they became influenced by Christian theology. The Orbis Terrarum, or OT model of the world, was shaped by the significance of the number 3 in Christian mythology. Being the number of the Trinity, it just made sense that the world, created by God, should reflect the existence of that creator. The existence of 3 continents, known since antiquity, fit very nicely into the Christian worldview. From this point of view, physical reality was reflective of divine reality. Or to put it another way, Our understanding of the physical world was shaped by our understanding of the metaphysical world. Since the earth is the center of God's creative energies, the center of the world will be the place that occupies the center of God's attention. And in the Christian tradition, there's no place more central to God's activity in the world than Jerusalem. Where the center of the world is located is determined by why it's the center of the world. And this is the very picture, or perhaps we should say metaphor, of the world that dominated throughout the Middle Ages. God looking down on the center of his creation, working his will amongst the destiny of humanity. The further you move away from Jerusalem, the further from God's attention and plan you moved. On the edge of the world were the strange, barbarian people noted in ancient histories and anthropologies like that of Pliny the Elder, who, though he never actually visited them, describes the sub-Saharan people of Africa in the most bizarre terms. Similarly, for a medieval author like Dante, one could view a theological concept like hell or purgatory or even heaven in geographical terms. The lines between physical and metaphysical geography didn't exist at all in the way that we would recognize. But this paradigm of sacred geography, this world where place not only had meaning, but where place was determined by its meaning, was about to come, along with the rest of the medieval world, to a very ignoble end. The second of our intellectual revolutions of the Renaissance is the Geographical Revolution, a revolution that would fundamentally and forever alter the way people understood the physical world around them. But this revolution was set in motion for the most mundane of reasons. It begins with a search for a passage to India, first looking east, then turning to the west, and finally looking for a way to circumnavigate the globe. Our story begins with Europeans striving to find a cheaper source for the spices and silks that came from Asia and which, due to the disposable income suddenly available to those who had survived the bubonic plague of 1346, were in ever-increasing demand. The superpowers of the day, Spain and Portugal, would soon be locked in a war of exploration to increase the supply of these luxury goods to European markets. Of course, trade between Asia and Europe had an ancient history, and there were two primary routes by which Asian luxury goods made their way toward Europe. From China, goods traveled via camel train across the high plateau of the Silk Road to Constantinople, where they would be transferred to ships that then set sail for the southern ports of Europe, particularly Italy. The other route was from India to Yemen, then to Egypt, overland to Alexandria, and then onto ships bound for the ports of Europe. In both cases, goods had to pass through a multitude of middle markets and traders, which increasingly added to the overall retail cost of products which finally made their way into Europe. What Europeans needed was a way to cut out all these middlemen and go directly to the source in India and in China, where they could buy wholesale and in bulk. But there was one not-so-small problem that stood in their way. There was, of course, no GPS system for people in the Middle Ages, and reliable magnetic compasses were not yet widely available in Europe. Even if they had been, they'd have been of very little use, as the maps of the day, as we'll see in a moment, weren't very reliable. Thus, navigation was a matter of applied geometry and astronomy. Europeans had worked out rudders, or navigational charts, of the Northern Hemisphere that allowed sailors to triangulate their position from just about anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. The key to these rudders was the ability to find a single fixed point to begin your calculations, and the common point they used was the North Star, Polaris. The problem for European navigators is that as you sail south around the coast of Africa, Polaris falls lower and lower on the horizon, until about 3 degrees north of the equator, it falls below the horizon. When that happened, you just sailed off the edge of the world. This meant that navigation around Africa required sailing close to the coastline, which, as it turns out, is extremely dangerous. Hence, the continent of Africa had prevented Europeans from sailing directly to India until the late 15th century. Vasco da Gama, sailing under the Portuguese flag, was the first to successfully circumnavigate Africa. Having survived the voyage, da Gama returned to Europe with a rudder of the southern hemisphere. This allowed those in possession of such a rudder to sail the deeper, safer waters out of the sight of the African coast and live to tell the tale. Thus, the Portuguese were off to the races, picking up Indian spices, which actually mostly came from Southeast Asia, by the boatload, and undercutting all of their rivals, particularly the Spanish. Now, not to be outdone, the Spanish, the other great superpower of the day, were busy looking for a western passage to India. After all, since the world was round, all you needed to do was sail west, and you'd end up in the east. But wait, didn't everybody think that the world was flat? Nope. That's another falsehood perpetuated by grade school teachers everywhere on Columbus Day. In fact, Eratosthenes of Alexandria had for all practical purposes invented both physical geography and scientific cartography in the 3rd century BCE, and he had experimentally demonstrated what Aristotle had only asserted, that the Earth is in fact a sphere. Not only that, Eratosthenes had measured the circumference of the Earth within a 2% margin of error. So Columbus, as well as everybody else that had a decent education at the time, knew that sailing west would land him in the east. What he lacked was an accurate rudder, because the maps of the day were woefully inadequate. The best maps available in the late 15th century were based on the world map of Claudius Ptolemy. And yes, that's the same Ptolemy we've already met. And as you can see, it doesn't include much of anything between Europe and China. That's not just because Europeans hadn't been there yet, but also because when Ptolemy calculated the circumference of the Earth, his results were wildly less accurate than those of Eratosthenes. And because of one of those silly accidents of history, Ptolemy's works had become popular, while Eratosthenes hadn't. So Columbus didn't have a clue how far it was from Europe to China. We can, however, get an idea of just how inaccurate Ptolemy's calculations were by superimposing the yet-to-be quote-unquote discovered continents of North and South America on a contemporary map based on Ptolemy's calculations. It's fairly clear that while Columbus had the right idea, the world was indeed spherical, the world would turn out to be, as Eratosthenes had already demonstrated, a much bigger place than anybody had expected. But off he went in 1492, and, well, you know the rest of that story. Now, while King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, for whom the Italian Columbus was sailing, were disappointed that he'd failed to find a western passage to India, it turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Europe was, by this time, fast running out of the hardwood forests that were necessary to build the ships upon which the Spanish economy rested. And the New World, as it was called, was covered with what seemed to be an endless supply of the raw materials a maritime empire like Spain needed. So while they didn't get a supply of nutmeg and curry powder, they did get all the raw materials they needed to continue fueling their superpower status well into the next century. This was made easier by the fact that the indigenous populations that peopled this quote-unquote New World made the horrible mistake of thinking that the Spanish were gods when they arrived in their puffy pants and funny-looking boats. And by the time they'd discovered their all-too-mortal nature, it was too late. Now, the quest for a western passage to India would not end with Columbus. The Spanish would recruit Ferdinand Magellan as a free agent from their Portuguese rivals. And in 1519, he'd set out with an armada of ships financed by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who also, confusingly enough, was Charles I of Spain, to make the first successful circumnavigation of the globe. Unfortunately for Charles, and even more so for Ferdinand, who was killed in the Philippines, the Southwestern Passage was not economically viable as a trade route. and so attention would shift toward a northwest passage of Asia. But that's another story altogether. In conclusion, what we discover in exploring this geographical revolution is that the world, like the cosmos and the scientific revolution, turned out to be quite different than everyone thought it was. Not only did this set in motion a series of geopolitical conflicts that we call colonialism that would continue to dominate world history until the middle of the 20th century, it also had the effect of causing people to be skeptical when they made knowledge claims about the world. Prior to the Geographical Revolution, Europeans thought of physical geography in religious terms, with Jerusalem being both the spiritual and physical center of the world, hence part of the motivation for the Crusades only a few hundred years before. But now that entire medieval geographical view was busted. Everything people thought they knew about the physical world was just as wrong as what they thought they'd known about the heavens. Now let's review. The Renaissance is a period of intellectual upheaval, as demonstrated in three distinct intellectual revolutions. The Geographical Revolution is characterized by the discovery of the New World, the beginnings of colonialism, and the rejection of sacred geography. The world, far from the traditional European point of view, was turning inside out. These changes contributed to the rise of skepticism. After all, if everything we thought we knew about the world turned out to be so inaccurate, maybe we don't know much of anything at all. Certainly, we ought to be skeptical of ancient authorities in matters of fact like geography. Even worse, though Ptolemy turned out to be very mistaken in his understanding of the world, another ancient, Eratosthenes' views were more or less accurate. The point is, just because something comes from the past doesn't mean that it's correct, which challenged the whole concept that old meant true. Just like us, the ancients could be right or wrong, and the only way to find out is to go and investigate for ourselves.